So, because I've started late, we'll go for about 3-5 minutes, and I'd suggest you make a general statement. Like there is media watching, actually, and others, normal people. And
like them.
I've read your submission. It's good. It's helpful. Maybe you talk for 10 minutes or so about the general points, and then I'll have 1 or 2 questions and so on.
Great, thank you. So we're really pleased to be asked to make this submission and to speak at this inquiry. Per Capita is an independent think tank. We work on private inequality and building a new vision for Australia. We want to acknowledge the importance of this inquiry, being an opportunity for people, particularly those more vulnerable groups, to be heard and be able to speak about their experiences over the last couple of years. So many of them are experiencing cost of living crises in a more disproportionate way. We, in our submission, which you have, focus on the sort of legislative settings that we think have made it easier for companies to profit while workers and customers struggle. We have our written submission, and we're happy to take questions on that, but a couple of comments about it first. So in the last few years, things have been pretty rough for Australians. We've had, after decades of wage stagnation, inflation is now eating into real wages, and the global pandemic, severe weather events, disruptions in supply chains, and energy shortages have all contributed to the increase in the price of everyday essential items. But it's determining what constitutes a reasonable price when you're at the supermarket is quite difficult. We don't know if these price spikes are because of external factors when we're at the checkout, or if there's something more dishonest at play, if firms are taking advantage of these circumstances. What we do know, looking at data on sales and revenue prices and profits, is that the power imbalance between workers and bosses, between businesses and consumers, is growing. And whilst this period has been really challenging, we think we should look at this as the new normal. We think we're going into what will be a scary summer and decades of more extreme weather events. And what we have experienced this year, so even though recent data is sort of showing that profits are dropping and prices are falling, that might be a bit of a reprieve, but the cracks in our legislative settings that were exposed in the pressure cooker at the start of 2023, they'll emerge again. Australian competition, consumer and industrial laws aren't quite working the way that we think they should. So a key issue that we've identified in our submission is competition, state of competition in Australian markets. We have a competition problem in Australia, and that is that we don't have enough of it. And the competition deficit in Australian industries, particularly in those which we rely on for essential items and services, hurts consumers, it hurts workers, and there is mounting evidence that it fuels inequality. The Australian supermarket giants exist in a very concentrated market, particularly in international standards. So if you compare Coles and Woolworths to Tesco's and Sainsbury's, Coles and Woolworths have a 65% share of the market, whereas the other two in the UK have a 42% share of the equivalent market. And anyone shopping at Coles and Woolworths is going to have noticed that prices have gone up, and they've gone up more than inflation. And I understand we're told that we should shop around, but where? If we say in our submission, if you just go outside this building, within a 15-minute walk, you can find 3 Coles and 7 Woolworths, a real physical symbol of the concentrated market. But food's a necessity, it's an unavoidable expense, and many Australians are struggling to pay their grocery bills, while at the same time, these big companies are posting record profits in excess of $1 billion. Research into concentration in Australian industries has shown that some industries, the ones that we rely on for our essential items and services, so department stores, banking, health insurance, supermarkets, massive airlines, the biggest 4 firms control 80% of the market in these industries. And that's a problem because of the clear relationship between competition and rising inequality. In our submission, we speak a bit about consumer law and some of the issues that we've identified. We also acknowledge that there are some changes in the pipeline for both the Australian consumer law and industrial relations law. And we think that these are really important because of the effect they'll have on competition, but also because of the effect competition has on inequality. We also highlight a study from the UK that looked at the enforcement and effective deployment of competition law and other policy tools, and how when the researchers in this study found that, when competition law enforcement was working, it resulted in better savings for everybody, but proportionally better savings for low income and average income households. We think it's pretty clear that the unwavering trust that governments have put in, have previously put in the market's capacity to self-regulate and produce competitive results has been misplaced, which is why we push for a sort of agenda. We've gone through examples there, but we'll be able to take questions. I just want to pass over to my colleague Matt to give an example of the mortgage market and how that shows some of the issues that we discussed in our discussion.
Thanks, Sarah. So I think I just wanted to complement Sarah's submission or our submission with a little illustration, which is taken from the mortgage market. So as Sarah pointed out, many of the areas in which we're seeing enormous price growth, which potentially could be seen as price gouging, is in essential goods and services. Now, in the mortgage market, mortgages under our kind of current settings are almost non-essential, almost an essential item, rather. You kind of have to get a mortgage to buy into the wealth generation and tax provisions that we've provided for people in Australia. And the reason why we focus so much on competition in this sub is that we think that regardless of whether short-term price gouging is taking place, the long-run effect of poor competition on consumers is effectively leading to the same outcome. So in some ways, the situation is more insidious if short-term price gouging isn't taking place. We're just seeing the normal run-of-the-mill lack of competition effects taking place. So I just want to give a quick deviation into the UK and Australian mortgage markets. So UK and Australian banks, they make roughly the same sort of percentage profits, but they do so in quite different ways. When you look at the UK, there's far more fierce competition for the mortgage market, to the point where you have a much better spread of mortgage products. So in the UK, it's very easy to find a fixed rate mortgage for a reasonable rate that's fairly close to the current base rate. Around 55% of the mortgage market in the UK is controlled by the biggest four, compared to 75 or 80% here. And right now in Australia, the big four account for 9 out of 10 new mortgages.
Who does the other bit, 45 in UK?
It's a much broader spread, and you do have more mutuals, building societies, non-profit making entities are there as well, and you do have non-bank financial institutions as well. So the effect of this has an enormous material impact on households because of the way it structures the market. So in the UK, this competition has driven down variable rate mortgage take-up. We have a far higher take-up of fixed rate products, which over a period like we've just seen protects consumers. So while the UK base rate has gone up significantly faster and further than the Australian base rate, they're at 5.25% now as their base rate. We're at 4.1. The effect on consumers is far less. So the average UK mortgage holder has seen a 0.5% increase in their mortgage rate, whereas in Australia, we're looking at a 2% increase, and that's to February of this year. And the effect of that, the difference of that on a 700K mortgage is around $300 a month.
Just, you kind of mentioned, quite take it in, with the UK, the higher rate of fixed rate mortgages.
Yeah.
Did you have any idea of the proportion? Yeah, I think you mentioned.
Yeah, so in 2016, around half of all mortgages were fixed. There's 50 fixed, and then now it's down to 15% are at variable. Everyone else is on fixed rates.
Yeah.
Because people were seeking to protect themselves during the crisis.
Yeah, down to 15, did you say? 15%
on variables, and here we're at 80%.
The other way.
Yeah. So we're basically a mirror image.
And America is somewhat, the US has got a lot of fixed rates too.
Well, they've got the Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac 30-year fixed rate product. So the effect on consumers in the US is hardly anything at all, because of government-backed purchasing facility in the secondary mortgage market. So the government's saying, we want to encourage more of this kind of mortgage, 30-year fixed rate, because we know it provides stability to consumers. So they're willing to buy it in that market. So right now, if you look at what you can buy on, or what sort of mortgage you can get on the open market, in the UK, despite the base rate being 5.25%, you can get a 5-year fixed for less than that, slightly less, 5.24% right now.
Yeah.
If you want to get a 5-year fixed here, despite the base rate being 4.1%, you'd be lucky to get a fixed 5-year mortgage for 5.75%. So the effect there, what we're seeing is that, you know, banks in the UK aren't gold standard at the moment in terms of their ethical practices. But what they do have is competition driving them to provide something that is a much safer, more effective product for consumers. We just want to use that as an illustration of why we focus so much on competition law.
Yeah, and just to highlight on that, how that lack of competition allows companies to be lazy. And I mean, well, not that recent, but over the last couple of years, there have been allegations with the Ombudsman about really large instances of underpayments and wage theft. And it's unbelievable to us that a company can reach the height of being a market giant and not learn how to pay their workers. I think that rather than it being that, it's probably something to do with knowing that you can get away with these things, that workers aren't able to go elsewhere and find another job, and consumers aren't able to shop elsewhere.
Yeah, and when you talk to people in the banks in providing the mortgages, you know, they'll tell you fairly openly they rely on what they call lazy loans, which is where, you know, the ACCC found that banks like to obscure what the real rate of the product is. And part of the reason is because they just don't want people moving around. So in the banking sector, you will hear people talk about lazy loans, where people should be able to just call up and say, can you do me a better rate? If they did that, they would get a lower rate, but they don't. And so the banks are happy to just keep on harvesting that money. So without some sort of competition impetus, we're going to see more of the same, whether there's a massive spike in gas prices internationally, a war in Ukraine, or climate emergency. The competitive settings in Australia are producing these kind of outcomes regardless.
By the way, no, the Competition Tribunal is doing this Suncorp. Interesting to hear. It makes a difference if there's a consumer voice.
Well, I mean, and in our submission, whilst we talk about competition a lot, we do go into detail about the, you know, those two sides of the same coin. The competition laws and consumer, they're in the same place, but consumer laws and how people being able to make complaints with avenues that allow them to make a complaint for things that aren't misleading or deceptive, but don't reach that high bar of being unconscionable conduct. But we also appreciate that those legislative changes are in the pipeline. We just think that they are. That what the last period has highlighted is how important they will be.
So a couple of quick points on that. I noticed what you said in here. By all means, strengthen unconscionable conduct law. The unconscionable conduct law has an exception for prices, does not cover prices. It says it right there. It says upfront prices are exempt. So you can never argue a price is unconscionable. One of the submissions, I'm getting this afternoon from Professor Philip Clark, which you might get from the ACTU or something, or off our website, argues unconscionable conduct exception for upfront prices should go. It's an interesting idea. I think there are a lot of problems with it, frankly. And I've always been a strong supporter of having unconscionable conduct laws, but you might be interested to pick up on that.
Yeah, I mean, with the unconscionable conduct laws, last couple of years, kind of dealing with what statutory unconscionable conduct is versus the equitable within the written law. Unconscionable conduct has been a bit tricky, and with the courts, it seems to be favouring a more conservative approach to it. I think there are changes we could make to unconscionable conduct itself, like making it prospective. I think one issue that regulators have with unconscionable conduct is evidentiary issues. So the victims are often, or people, victims of unconscionable conduct are often really vulnerable people who aren't, might not have good record keeping, might sort of not do well under cross-examination. So yeah, I think there's a couple of things that could happen there. Also omissions, like in misleading and deceptive conduct, but I still don't think that, I think there needs to be another thing. Like, I don't think we could just kind of reform unconscionable conduct. I think we need something similar to Article 5, Article 5 of the EU directive, or the American Fair Trading anyway.
It's in the sub,
yeah, that kind of goes in between.
I know. I've been
Appropriate, like, I understand that I'm telling somebody who knows a lot more about this.
So, well, I've been on that unconscionable. What I think actually is, by all means, go for a change in the statute. But someone, maybe you should put up some ideas about making it less legalistic. That's never simple in Australia because of the judicial separation of judicial powers under the Constitution. Just as a guide, it's not a very good guide, but I did a report for the government, the Migrant Worker Task Force, and it was about the fact that there is a legal framework for underpayment that doesn't really work, and it had a whole lot of suggestions to make it easier, and that included something like a small claims approach. Small claims, there's a bit of potential there if there's a bit of statute and different machinery. Now, look, I'm aware of all the complications, but to work as you're implying on the process procedures, evidentiary standards, and how to deal with smaller matters would be possibly a step forward.
Things like, misleading and deceptive conduct, I think, are clear, but unconscionable conduct is, you spend a whole unit in law school on section 20, section 21, you know, like it's incredibly confusing. I don't understand how anyone, and imagine trying to figure out the law of equity and statutory law while you're trying to determine whether you've been totally ripped off. No,
it will always be unclear. There are, I know. I mean, they've added lots of things to the Act about what it means. But I would encourage you to think about the processes and all that rather than the wording of the law, except there's that exception for prices. And the other thing I just mentioned, since you're on about it, the competition part of the Act differs from the EU, and there's nothing in there about excessive prices. The US doesn't have excessive prices, it's competition law. The EU does. Australia doesn't. The dominance test does include excessive prices. It'd be quite good if that was considered for introduction into the Act. I just mentioned that since you're on about legislation. The other thing I just want to ask you about, maybe briefly, is tell us a little bit more about the price impact on vulnerable people. So, I mean, there's a couple of sort of obvious things, but it'd be interesting if you spelled them out. Did I hear you mention disability or something at some point? Maybe, I don't know if maybe I was over listening to you, but people who are vulnerable, I mean, first of all, they often don't have much choice. If you're down and out and on low income or whatever, higher food prices affect you differently from how it would affect me. I mean, my food price goes up, fine, I'll draw on my savings. Most of us got something to draw on. People down at the bottom, they've got nothing there. So if they pay more for food, they have to give up something. And I found that, of course, Indigenous is an extreme case. And then there are other disabilities. Now, what could we do something about it? That's the question I just wanted to ask.
I mean, so obviously we speak a lot about legislative means. I don't think there's a law fairy that comes in and makes those things easier. And what we're suggesting is that might make it more difficult for companies to do these things like push up prices. But you're absolutely right. There is evidence that more Australians are turning to charities. I think it goes down to the inequality crisis that we have here, and the ability for especially supermarkets to do tricky things, to invest and spend their time trying to figure out how they make consumers buy more, and make these huge profits, while even their workers as well also often fall into that same category. Workers at supermarkets are paid quite low. The EBAs for major supermarkets often attach their wage increases to the annual minimum wage increase, as opposed to something that works in line with what their expected profits are. And so those same workers working in those stores find themselves in that vulnerable group. And I suppose the last comment I'd make, before I give over to Matt, if you have anything to add, is that it is, it's really expensive to be poor. You aren't able to, if I think about, can you buy a pair of leather boots, or do you need to buy 10 pairs of Kmart sneakers? And so I think that is how it affects vulnerable people more.
Yeah, and if you look at, we could go back to the mortgage example again, the number of people in mortgage stress is set to rise significantly as we're going to get to this fixed rate cliff, or we're in the fixed rate fall zone now, I guess, where people had that 2-3 year fixed rate in the lockdown period of coming out of that now. And, we talked about food prices excluding people from buying other things. Well, we're going to see people having to exclude food to pay the mortgage. So mortgage stress, we're going to see, a significant increase over the next few months. Is there a way to ameliorate it? Well, we could look at what kind, whether the government wants to look into providing a better mortgage option for low-income households. We see that in other countries where governments back a particular kind of mortgage product, long-term fixed rate, and it stimulates the private sector to actually do better as well. So I guess that's an example of that. Any
thoughts on rents?
Rents, we produced a report last month called Regulating Rentals, What Works. It includes a lot of recommendations on this topic. So we promote the idea of rent stabilisation, a policy similar to the ACTU, in which
ACT.
That's it.
Yeah.
Getting my acronyms mixed up here. The ACT, whereby rents can't go up by more than 110% of the CPI. So in that instance there, and it is something that's working well there, and it works well in a lot of jurisdictions, despite, there's a lot of animosity towards rent controls and rent freezes. This is a very different mechanism to a rent freeze, and it's been shown to work very well in other countries, particularly in Europe. So there's that. We can regulate Airbnbs, which the Victorian government announced yesterday, so we'll have a levy there. We also produced a paper on the effect of Airbnbs and short-term rentals on the long-term rental market 2 weeks ago. So we have a host of recommendations in both of those. Yeah.
In a nutshell, what's the effect on the rental market of Airbnb?
So it's very localized. So in Melbourne, we're talking about 28,000 or so short-term rentals, and that's about 1% of the entire dwelling stock. But if you go down to the peninsula, you might be looking in some neighbourhoods, 30% of the 30% of the housing stock is listed on a short-term rental platform. So that you can't, it's hard to say exactly how that sucks houses out, but we are seeing that houses are being sucked out of the long-term rental market because the profit rates, for example, on the peninsula, you can make the equivalent of the annual median rent in about 50 days of letting a place as an Airbnb. So without zoning rules, without taxation, without switching Airbnbs from residential to commercial rates, council rates, these kind of mechanisms, we're just going to see that proliferate.
And what about the argument, I'm just picking it up, to go along that Airbnb expands the market and increases supply?
Well, no, I mean,
no, it doesn't.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, no. If you look at how much money goes into investing in existing properties versus investing in new properties, like new construction, we've halved that rate over the last 25 years. Since we introduced the CGT discount and allowed people to trade houses as though they were just another asset, the amount of investment into new construction has halved as a proportion of investing in existing stock. But you can just pick it up. Your CGT discount kicks in after a year. Why would you not treat it like an asset, you know, a tradable bond or whatever? So so clearly new investment isn't being stimulated. Maybe there's an argument to say that holiday homes are being used more, and we're using holiday homes to house different people around different times of the year, but we're also seeing, in hotspot places like Byron, like on the peninsula, a big exodus of houses from the long term to the short term.
Yep. Have you lined up on this debate about non-compete clauses?
No, I mean, we didn't mention it in our.
No, I noticed, yeah.
Do you have any? I mean, that's
not that relevant to prices.
Well, I mean, I suppose it's relevant to the section that we talk about with workers and competition, and but no, we didn't go into it.
Yeah, and again, with market dominance being the concentrations being as they are, non-competes from somebody that controls 35% of the market has a much bigger impact on somebody than a non-compete against a company with 10% of the market.
Just interested anyway, generally in anything we know about the particular circumstances of vulnerable, disadvantaged consumers, which you've dealt with to some extent here.
Yeah, and we haven't gone into detail about stories. I think one of the reasons why this inquiry is so important is that there's been some news stories from like small stories like the coffee, what I kind of think of as a bit like Victory Coffee, down from $14 to $15. And we've been hearing those in the news, but I think the importance of an inquiry like this is to allow people to be able to share those stories from those groups. So we are really looking forward to what your findings are.
Yeah, I think we're sort of in this phase now where, we've got these an array of anecdotal examples, and what we need is for the data to catch up so that we can provide, trend data on some of these items.
Look, one just final thing, with the changing nature of the economy, the shift to services away from, if you like, goods. Now some of that gets automatically picked up, banks and retail distribution, but for me, it's interesting to see if there are pricing issues in the services area, because we all focus on the here and now goods. I don't know, but of course a lot of that's public sector, although it doesn't mean that doesn't raise issues like take health.
I think, and we haven't done the research on it yet, and I'm sure there is some out there, but like I know the ACCC is doing, they're still doing the inquiry into childcare.
Yes.
So things like that, the payment above the government payment, medical out-of-pocket expenses, particularly for psychologists and psychiatrists, the COVID-19 pandemic and the measures that came with that have caused ripple-on crises in their own ways, one of them being a mental health crisis. But the 10 free sessions, I no longer feel like 10 free sessions feels like you're still spending $80 even more to see a psychologist when you even after the rebate. So and obviously we haven't done that in our submission, but it is interesting research, and I think will help to fill in those gaps around services.
We also did some research into the rise of platform service providers in the NDIS, and how we've got US private equity firms coming here to invest in these companies that try and capture, like the Uber model. They try and capture a significant share of the market. They take no responsibility for their workers or for the service user, but they match and not necessarily, they match random people to provide NDIS services to NDIS participants. And they've seen $50 billion a year and they've gone, thank you very much, we'll come into that market. So I would, recommend looking at that. We didn't give a number on what the potential for price gouging or something along those lines is in that report, but we know that there's a significant proportion of the contract amount, 20% in some examples, being taken by the platform company for very little service. But by dint of their market share, they can take that.
Okay, well, thank you very, very much. And it's been helpful and useful to listen to. We may hear or ask you for more.
Thank you very much.
Good.
Nice to meet you.
See you. So you, James. What? Sorry, I'm running late. Something happened during the middle of it, holding out a bit.
No worries at all.
Yeah, wouldn't know. Sorry, me. Very much show for this. Okay, well, thank you. You are James Moore, Concordia Vox.
Yep.
Read your permission, thank you. By the way, just tell me about what Concordia Vox is about and does and so on.
Sure. So we're a for-profit business that operates in the ESG market. So that's sustainable investing, specialising in the S part, which is social factors. And in that frame, it's very much focused on looking at for unsustainable practices in how companies treat their staff or their customers that might impinge on long-term returns. So that's the angle we come at it from. But obviously, it's the confluence between good practices and good returns is what we're looking to drive.
Yeah. And I know you've got things in here. How does pricing fit in? I mean, how does a price gouging inquiry fit into your angle on the world?
Yeah. So in the submission, you'll notice that we particularly focus on what we're trying to attach the label of covert price gouging or covert practices. Having formed the view that this is where a territory where companies play in this place is where they're most likely to put at risk the long-term, if you like, viability of the company, and therefore pose the greatest risk to consumers. Not that there's not necessarily a wider problem with price gouging per se, but from an investor's point of view, you can at least form a judgment quite immediately around whether you think the company's pushing the limits with how much is raising prices, whereas with more covert practices, which we can dig into, it can be harder to really understand whether the current performance of the company is actually shakier than it looks. And obviously the Qantas examples that are in the media late are a really good example of that at play.
Yeah, the credit, the cancel bookings and some other things. Yes, and you give a whole lot of examples of covert forms of price gouging.
Yeah.
I wonder, I mean, I just buy what you said there, and shrinkflation is one. It's interesting, it goes on so much still. Actually, I think there are probably a couple of others that I can think of. Actually, I'll give you an example. I know someone who's crazy about buying the very latest books on the net. As soon as they come out, he's a big buyer. Now, he went to one supplier and he got a huge number of books. He thought, oh, they'll think I'm a good customer. But so I'll get a discount. But it was the opposite. They knew this person would buy the book at the most expensive time and would pay more. And he finally started comparing the price you got with others, they'd put up the price. And so that's a sort of covert thing you don't mention with all the discounts and other benefits. Thought I'd add that to your list.
Yeah.
And also, when people like maybe banks guarantee, you can have a bank account and all that, then they categorize the customers, and true, they give these things at the bottom, which is better than not, but they've got all these ways of differentiating customers, and they get different rates.
Yep.
The richer they are, the more they're worried about losing them, so they get a better deal than low-income people. I mean, they also get it because of the volume, but there's massive price discrimination that's covert that we don't really know about, and so on. That is part of your story about covert pricing.
Yes, I think that's entirely right. I mean, the way I would kind of look at it is to say that those examples can sometimes be positive in a well-functioning market. There'll be product differentiation. That's where you might tailor the service level or quality to different user groups. But when it's transparent and overt, then customers are free to choose the one that suits their needs. But when it's done more covertly and often not just hidden, but then denied that it's actually occurring, that the service is just as good as it's always been. In reality, though, consumers will find that if they want to continue getting the same service they used to get, they'll have to upgrade to a higher plan or whatever else. And so that's where it becomes a effective form of inflation, because to continue living to the standard they were used to living, they're now spending more than they were previously, even though the notional price for the service plan that they might have currently been on hasn't changed at all.
So anyway, in here you go into the covert thing, and there are issues legal about whether that's misleading or deceptive, which would be interesting to see tested sometime.
Look, I think that's right, and I think that's an example of what the ACCC is looking at doing already with the phantom flights that Qantas Group are alleged to have charged for. But there are forms that aren't necessarily as black and white as that, where the flight may not, for instance, sticking with aviation, where the flight may not have been cancelled yet, but they certainly know they're planning to. And so they're still looking to figure out, well, we're going to keep selling tickets at the prices that we can to extract, and then we're going to cancel the flight later. That can be potentially harder to prove, but still the net impact on consumers will be both if their flight is cancelled on their vacation, if they then need to fly a day earlier or later and incur additional costs or disruption, or if it just allows the airline to because if the flight they're cancelling is at a premium time, that customers will pay more. But then that's not the one they run. They run the off-peak time that customers wouldn't have paid more for. Then they've actually effectively been able to gouge through those means as well. So that's where one of the challenges will be from a regulatory standpoint, is proving that it's as necessarily something as black and white as the selling tickets on cancelled flights are. Which is why I guess then where we come into it, and certainly and want to just share this insight with the inquiry, is where we see a role for investors. If you're a long-term investor that's looking to hold your portfolio positions for a long period of time, you're more likely to not want to see these sorts of short-term practices that might produce a bump in the share price temporarily, but you don't sell out at the peak. So you will be there to suffer the pain when there's other consumer backlash, where there's regulatory action or whatever else that impacts on your returns. So for those sorts of investors, there's really a question of, well, should you be interested in covert pricing? Is it the sort of thing practice that, just like with a good climate change practice, that you would want to take into account when you're engaging with the companies you have shares in. Now, the answer that we would put to that is yes. And I guess part of the reason for attending here today is we think the inquiry also should think about encouraging investors to take an interest in this issue. And if I can kind of explain why in kind of two simple steps. The first one is that link between the longer term. You might get a short-term bump in the share price that's being held up by these practices, but as they come to light over time, you get the share price does eventually go down. The reason why this is material though is because, or at least with covert prices, is with covert practices, they almost inevitably play out this way, because once a board or management puts them in place, you can't, by their very nature, you can't really track or hold the operations to account on whether they're close to crossing the threshold, because as soon as you identify that there's a threshold at which your practices are harmful, then it almost calls into question whether you should be doing them in the first place.
Yeah.
So it's a very slippery slope for companies to start out down. Kind of like, the childhood of people would be taking that first cookie from the cookie jar. The first time you do it, no one notices.
Yeah.
Right? I might have one or two. Mum or dad won't notice that. Before you know it, the whole jar's gone. And in a way, that's kind of what we've seen with Qantas Group and their behaviour, where the practice has gotten so out of hand that it's now hard to hide, and everyone else is seeing it and talking about it but them.
So what else now? Put it in their ESG engagement to avoid covert price gouging. That seems to be a reasonable recommendation. I suspect you'd run into a fair bit of opposition on that one.
Yeah, well, I guess, this is part of the reason why I'm calling it out in the first place. Is traditionally, for an investor, the idea of companies being able to extract a greater return from their customers could be seen as a good thing. But again, this is where it really comes down to your perspective as an investor, whether you're taking a short-term horizon or a long-term horizon. Sure, if you're short-term and you're a stock picker where you're just looking to sell out at the peaks and troughs of a stock, then you might even welcome the activities that cause scandal and a stock to plummet, because then you can pick it up again and ride the roller coaster once more and make more money that way. But for the bulk of us who own shares through our superannuation, that outcome's a really bad one for us, because it's ultimately undermining the long-term returns that those companies could be earning. Whether it be the increased legal fees, whether it be, a good example for Qantas right now is the question of whether or not increased competition should be allowed through Qatar entering the market. Now, we can if we set aside the merits of that particular case for a moment, there is generally a legitimate argument for why governments should manage capacity carefully over the long term, so that you don't have capacity being flooded. Now, by Qantas mismanaging,
I'm not sure that's a good argument, but we'll let you get away with it.
There is. I think we can certainly have that argument, but the challenge that Qantas has caused for itself and its shareholders is by mismanaging so many other parts of their business, they've made it hard for government to credibly run that part of long-term policy making. Even so, you can set aside this particular decision, or we can talk about it, but it's still, this is an example of where a company can only let down all its stakeholders by running the short term too aggressively, and including and effectively inviting a less welcome regulatory environment in response.
And then the role of monopoly or quasi-monopoly assets, particularly with the supply chain. In fact, that's reasonable. Intermediate options. that'd be interesting, the compensation idea. And generally, utility regulation is another one here. I mean, they're all ideas well worth pursuing, which is part of my job in this inquiry. It's slightly interesting. I mean, it's an interesting angle that you're coming at it, particularly from an ESG angle, and the obligations on firms. We give them social license and so on. Social license, I assume, is part of the discourse from ESG.
That's right. I mean, it's often talked about in very abstract terms, and so that's where it's, for me, the current example in the aviation sector is a useful to have it made real, so that investors can see for themselves what it means when a firm is on the edge of abusing or losing its social license. Is helpful then for elevating where else in the economy should investors take a closer eye on the risk to firms' social license to operate based on how they're treating their customers.
There is, of course, an interesting one, probably come up for Qantas, the so-called two-strike rule, where shareholders at an annual general meeting can vote against their remuneration plan. If they do that twice, 2 years in a row, the board faces a total spill. It's quite an interesting way of getting at them on their obligations to investors, because that's not quite the same as everyone. An interesting angle.
Yes.
Anyway, this is good. Thank you. It's been interesting. I will take account of it. If we have more questions and that, we will get back to you. Does that cover your interest?
Right, absolutely.
Great. Well, thank you very much.
Thanks. Thank you.
Good.
Good luck with the inquiry.
Thank you. See ya.
See you then.
Oh, we have a break. Right. Okay, well, welcome, Danielle Jager.
Yes.
Yeah, and so welcome to the inquiry, and we'd like to hear what you have to say on prices.
Absolutely. I've got a few notes written down,
Yeah.
if that's okay. Just as a little bit of a warning, I do tend to talk quickly
That's all
when
right.
I'm nervous. So thank you for keeping.
Better quick than slow.
Yeah.
And what's your own background, by the way?
So I am a pediatric nurse. I've been a nurse for 20 years. I don't have any children. And yeah, so I think, yeah, I'm not sure.
All right. Good. And what's your interest in this inquiry?
I think my interest is the effect it is having on people and the community widespread in terms of the price gouging.
Yeah.
How significant the price gouging is.
Yeah.
And how there are people struggling just to deal with basic necessities. No.
Yeah. You see it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Where do you work, by the way?
This off the record.
Oh, I shouldn't feel public. Anyway,
I work for the department.
yeah. Of health.
Yeah, of education.
Oh, education.
Yes.
Oh, good. Anyway, why don't you tell us what you have to say?
Thank you. I just want to say as well that today I feel really a little bit vulnerable in terms of sharing my experience with everyone. But I'm definitely grateful to be here and that this inquiry is taking place as well.
Good.
Today, some of what I'm sharing with you, I haven't really shared with some of the closest people in my life. But I feel it's important to be part of this inquiry and to let people know the struggles that people who are human beings are dealing with every day. So we're here today discussing price gouging and how it's affecting people and their living and their quality of life. And I'm a nurse and never thought I would be where I am today in terms of experiencing the difficulties of financial stress because of the price gouging that's happening in my life. And I see it with other people in my life and across the whole community. People are crumbling and the pressure of it all is absolutely significant. I feel really fortunate because I have a full-time job. I have a roof over my head. I am able to put food in the fridge, but I'm still having to make really difficult decisions, such as do I go to the doctors or do I pay for some prescriptions? Can I attend that specialist appointment? What do I have to compromise every fortnight, every day to be able to live in terms of meet my own, look after my own health and well-being. I have some anxiety and PTSD, and I'm constantly having to review whether I can see my psychologist, this month, and make decisions like that. Can I pay for the treatment, for my dog? So it's quite significant, the difficulties. And I know there are people that are worse off than me in terms of having to really decide whether they pay for food or pay the electricity bill. And I think, I grew up in a family with lower that were classed as probably lower economic status as well. And my parents, they worked to the bone. They both had 2 or 3 jobs each just to support us 5 children. And I remember looking at them thinking how hard they worked, how much they went without, and how much they had to compromise, and thinking, I'm never going to be like that. And it really dawned on me yesterday that that's exactly what I am. I feel like I am working to the bone. I feel like I am struggling. I know there are stages where I was wearing shoes with holes in them because I couldn't afford to replace them, because it would mean something else would have to be compromised or affected in order to do that. I feel extremely embarrassed and ashamed because of the effect it's having on me and people across the whole community as well. And that, I think, even translates when I go to work and I'm wearing the same clothes or the same shoes. And I'm not saying people are judging me or that they notice, but at the same time feeling extremely humiliated, thinking how on earth can they not notice? I feel a bit housebound as well and trapped because there's even basic repairs on my unit that I'm unable to make. I'm consistently reviewing whether I can downsize from my unit into something more affordable to be able to pay my mortgage or reduce payments as well. But I don't live in an affluent area and it's not really an option. No, this is definitely affecting my health and well-being. I get really distressed when I'm invited to a birthday party, or invited out to a restaurant or a cafe for lunch or dinner, because they're luxuries now. And I never thought I would be sitting here saying that it would be a luxury to go out to dinner, to go out to lunch, or be able to afford to buy my friend or my nephews and nieces a birthday present. Because I know that in order to buy them a present or in order to go out for lunch or even enjoy something like a coffee, there's something else that has to be compromised in place of that. And I feel fortunate because I know there are people that are doing it a lot worse than I am and are having to make more critical decisions. But there are times where, like I said, I've worn shoes with holes in them. I've skipped meals, or I've lived off toast for a little bit. The increase of living costs is absolutely across the board significant. And for me, it's been utility bills, gas, electricity, water, internet service costs, food costs have been absolutely significant. And then insurance, like I feel really, really, really privileged to be able to say that I can actually have house insurance, because they are decisions that people are having to make. And, I hear all the time, people do not have insurance on their cars or their houses because they can't afford it because of the significant increase in costs of those. And for me, my house insurance has gone up by 40% this year alone. There's so many people suffering who are told because of this price gouging, they have to suffer some more. I worry about the vulnerable people that are worse off than me. I never thought I would be in a situation where I would be thankful that I do not have elderly parents to support or to have children, because of the pressures of the cost of living. I never, ever thought I would say that. I'm so stressed in terms of financially that I'm looking at getting a second job. I already work full time and I feel like I have the best job in the world, but it's not enough for me to even be able to pay for necessities, like I said, to be able to attend an appointment with my psychologist, to be able to pay for medication, to be able to go to the doctor, to be able to pay all the bills that are coming in, I'm now looking at having to get a second job, and I know there are people that are already working 2 or 3 jobs. And this is really devastating. I think for me, I can usually deal with the increase of one thing, whether it be the gas bill or the electricity bill or the insurance or the cost of food, but it has been significantly increased across the whole board. And I don't feel like it's been justified, especially when I'm seeing big corporations who are reaping the benefits of this in terms of the profits they are making. You know, and I'd just like to provide some concept as well, because just in review of the cost of my gas, electricity, water, internet costs, house insurance, mortgage, and car insurance, in a 12-month period, I'm now having to look for an extra $8,700 that I'm having to try and scramble to find. In terms of my wage, in the last 12 months, my wage has gone up $102. So that's $2 a week. And I'm trying to have to find at least $168 a week to meet that huge deficit. And this is not, if it's not price gouging, what else is it? It's not sustainable, I think, for anyone. You know, I just don't know how people can keep going when it's affecting our livelihoods. It's affecting our health and our well-being. And people are, if not already broken, at breaking point. And I think there's lots of things I miss, you know, because of this price gouging. You know, I miss not having to worry about whether I can afford a cup of coffee. I miss, you know, doing something like going to the football, or, you know, being able to connect with friends, you know, for my own health and well-being, whether it, you know, be going to a cafe. You know, I miss knowing I can take my nephews and nieces to the movies, or even buy them an ice cream without having to worry about the compromise that I'll have to make, and whether I can even do that. In the meantime, you know, people across the whole community are having to make really difficult decisions and compromises that affect their health and well-being. To me, it just feels unjust, and it doesn't feel right. It just does not make sense how these big corporations are making huge profits. If it's not price gouging, what is it? Yeah, I just want to say, like, price gouging, like, can you see the real cost? Because it's affecting human beings, and we're having to make difficult decisions to even be able to continue to live in such difficult circumstances.
Well, thank you very much for that. I know it's a painful subject for you, but it is extremely useful, valuable. It's a real contribution that you come out and speak about it and tell us about its impact on you. We're more used to the abstract world of statistics and so on, and it's to hear the human experience of it is really important. And in your case, it's been very emotional and moving to hear how it's affected you. One of the things I think about is that with regard to you were saying, well, if you have more food, you miss out on this or vice versa. And there are just many people in your situation who have to actually choose between goods and services. Now, better off. It doesn't come through in that way. There's the price gouging. Something goes up, well, you don't like it, you feel exploited. And in the end, you're well enough off that you can absorb it and you don't have to give up another thing for it. But you've got very little to fall back on, I assume.
Absolutely.
And so everything has to be dealt with on the spot.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think what I don't have to fall back on, I think is nearly a majority of Australians at the moment who are really struggling because they're having to live from one paycheck to the other. And they're, like I said, having to make really difficult decisions. Can I buy new shoes? Can I pay for that shopping bill? Can I go to that appointment? And these are decisions that I don't think anyone should have to make.
And I was going to ask you one thing, about your insurance. It's home, is it?
It's, house insurance. It's for a unit. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you can shop around?
Yes.
Do you do that?
I do that. And I feel like that's another job in itself.
It is.
Because I do that even with the utility bills, with internet service providers, phone providers, and like you do that. I have to say that even going shopping, like whether at Coles or Woolworths, if I go, it's rare that I pay for anything full price, because you just can't. It's not sustainable.
Yeah. What area do you shop in?
It's usually Aldi, or I just go to the fresh, little markets, fruit and veg markets, because I find that their prices are usually a bit more reasonable.
Yeah. And on the whole, Aldi gives a better price, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But I've even seen price increases in Aldi as well.
What locality of Melbourne are you talking about?
The western suburbs.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
And it sounds like at least you're doing the right thing shopping. In insurance, they're big price different. I know it's a pain.
It is.
It's quite difficult shopping around.
Just time consuming, and something I never thought I'd have to do. But with a significant increase in costs, you're sort of left with no choice.
The insurers generally, if you go to them first time, they'll give you a low price to attract you. And then the problem is that they escalate it quite heavily once they've got you in, because they know, like you're getting at, shifting is quite inconvenient, to say the least. And same with energy. And it's also confusing, so these things. Well, look, I think it's been very useful for me for this inquiry for the ACT to hear your first-hand experiences, the pressure it puts on you. Also, I was very interested in comments on the health side of it and have to fork out extra for any psychology help and all that sort of thing.
Seeing a specialist.
Seeing a specialist.
Absolutely. Yeah, or I've had to make decisions where I just can't see the specialist.
Because they all charge extra.
Absolutely, and it's even if you need a scan, whether it be a CT or MRI or something, like the cost of that is huge as well. It's more around the upfront costs. I know there's usually some rebate to some degree, but it's having to have that money available to be able to do that.
Yeah. And so it's interesting, we're hearing about price gouging in traditional goods, food and energy and so on. But I do think in the health area and others, actually there's been a bit of price gouging in vocational education, sort of price gouging other things that have not been that good. But in health, whether you call it price gouging or whatever, all the prices you pay, the gap things, gap related things, they're very, very extensive all over.
They are, and they
Yeah.
vary
And you've
significantly
got
as
no
well.
choice as a rule. Is bulk billing as a GP at that level, is bulk billing available?
If you can find a GP that bulk bills,
Yes, less these days.
absolutely
And then specialists and psychologists. I
forget
did
it.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely forget it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's it's not sustainable, any of it.
Do you work like in the, what about you deal with children or do you advise? And do you see many of them? Where do you do your pediatric nursing here in the West?
No, so my pediatric nursing is mainly in the inner east.
Oh, right.
There's quite a lot of diversity in terms of socioeconomic status
Yeah.
in that area. And yeah, there are parents who are absolutely distressed because they can't access services because
Yeah.
of the cost of them as well.
Hmm. Oh, well, look, thank you very much for coming and telling us all about that. It makes an impact hearing it from you.
Thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I think Corey Erlam, is that right?
Correct.
Corey Erlam, Council of the Ageing, and you've put in a submission. Actually, I just got 5 minutes ago, I have a quick glance on mine, and it's handy to have it here. Thank you. Look, what I suggest you do is give us kind of a 10-minute overview. By the way, there are some people watching on camera, and including possibly media. So maybe run us through the points you want to make. I've kind of picked up some of this, but absorb it all. And then I'll have some questions and there may be some issues you want to dig into.
Yeah, sure.
So over to you, Corey Erlam.
Thank you, Professor Fells, and thanks to the ACTU for looking into this very complicated, what's causing the increase in prices that's hurting the hip pocket of older Australians, because it is one of the largest things we get phone calls and emails about what's actually happening here. We did a bit of surveys of older people around the cost of living pressures earlier in the year. And what we sort of discovered was that people were, based on some results from last year and then into the beginning, so Q1 of this year, and we think it's gone worse since then. People were marginally surviving, but they were starting to feel the pain. They were starting to do choices between going to the doctor or buying food, putting on energy versus getting pet care. These sort of trade-offs were occurring.
Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah, I see the different categories of people, a lot of them, like you bring out, they've got to choose between things. I mean, some people are coming with previous person. Some people, the better off people, they don't like higher prices for this or that, but they've got resources, say whatever they can draw on, and it doesn't really affect them that much. But there's another category you've fingered here, who they cop a price rise, then they've got to pay it. And if they do, they've got to give up something.
Yeah, and look, when we represent over 9 million Australians over 50, we've got a very diverse range of people in that cohort. But so if you're looking at the low income, fixed income, so somebody on a pension, somebody on a job seeker, particularly those who are renting, that's the kind of people who we see on all of the service indicators are the most vulnerable and the most impacted by significant price rises. And just tell us slightly more about the renting bit, because 50 years ago, more older people had their own house, didn't they? And the number on renting is fairly high. So, look, across the board, more people are renting than they are homeowners. Divorces are causing more older women to be one of the fastest growing groups at risk of homelessness, because whilst they might have a little bit of an asset, they haven't got enough to purchase a home outright. We also see that more people are retiring with a mortgage. Now, that may be part of a financial plan to be able to pay off from their superannuation. It's also particularly a strategy when older people struggle to get access to credit, because the way that we treat their income, banks tell me the Credit Act tells them the way we treat pensions and the way we treat a superannuation annuity is different to the way that they'll treat somebody who's got a salary in a way. So just say a bit more about that. They'll hold the line. They'll hold their line of credit through a mortgage as a way to have money for a rainy day. Because they won't be able to get a credit card, they won't be able to get a loan to buy a new car. And we're talking, from 67 to living to 100, the 33-year horizon. You're probably going to be replacing your car once or twice during that time. So. Diverse range, fixed income particularly affected by it. The areas they're particularly coming in at the moment is the cost of energy coming through. They'll prioritise maintaining their private health insurance, but that levy is going up and up. Changing whether they're putting on the heater or whether they're just using a blanket. These sorts of things make people start feeling a little bit resentful when they then see in the recent round of profit margins that have been delivered. How much some of the companies are actually earning. So, we've just had a major telco go through all of their products and increase their prices at the same time as posting a couple of $1 billion profit for the financial year, and people going, why when I'm being charged extra here, energy, telecommunications, mobile phone, internet access, the price of a grocery basket at home, not being able to go out for an extra little bit of meal during the fortnight, because I just can't afford it at the end of the time. Yes, we do see the pension indexed, and we do see that rise, but as you know, that's a 6-month lag from what we actually have as the cost of living increases that occur before that comes through. We'll see things like Commonwealth rent assistance, the maximum amount being $185 a fortnight that somebody can get, so $92.50. Not a lot of homes out there where that's going to give you a lot of relief, when we've seen 11.5% increases in rents over the last 12 months as of July 23, and that's been going up further. So, an example from somebody who's 70, in the 70s range, living in a rural area, part pensioner and a homeowner. These are often perceived to be the more affluent because they're a homeowner. Budget's tight and money's always at the forefront of my mind. This is stressful, but I need to manage this as best as I can. It's hard going. They're showing a sense of resilience, but it's quite challenging for them. An older woman, 50 to 60, who is employed, the rent's been the biggest impact, and the loss of work meant that we went through our savings. We now live week to week. This is stressful. These are some of the changes that come through. Cost of insurances of all types appear to have increased rapidly. I understand what I risk if I do not renew policies, but sometimes it's difficult to find the additional sums required. In recent years, with Australian bushfires and flooding, such tragedies are happening. A 70-year-old man, part pensioner, living in a regional area, I desperately need new dentures. At $4,000, this is never going to happen. This affects nutrition, mental health, 3,600 house and car insurance, 2,400 for council rates, 2,000 for sewerage rates, 1,400 for car registration. It tops at about 10,000. With a declining income, something has to give. These are some of the things that we get coming through to us. But two areas I particularly wanted to draw attention to the discussion was you see it in the form of a meme on Facebook these days, the good old image of a $50 bill and a debit card charged to $50. $50 bill is still worth $50 after a transaction. These days, though, when you're paying by a card, after you do 10 transactions, that goes down to about $45 worth of values. That very simple comparison really struck me as an example when we're seeing banks close, when we're seeing a lack of access to cash, when we're seeing businesses say, I'm not going to accept the legal tender of cash because, unfortunately, they're saying the cost of accessing it, the cost of maintaining it, taking it to the bank is too high. So in that environment of less availability, we're also slugging consumers with, anywhere from 0.4% to 2% every time they touch the card for the privilege of being able to pay by the only available method of payment. It seems inconsistent if we were reducing cash to save money while we're then directly passing that on to the consumer. Even to the blatant example of when you go to a credit card terminal to pay for your goods, you have $50 on the display screen, you tap it and you walk away with a debit of $50.50, for example, not even displaying the amount that you're actually paying until after you've made that payment. Challenging. I'm not suggesting that the percentages that banks are charging are right or wrong, but that sort of mentality of, well, we'll deliver our costs and then just pass it straight down to the consumer, probably one of the most transparent examples where you can see it actually happening. Where you can't see it happening is why are we paying more for things in industries that haven't had that much of greater cost increase? In aged care that we're working in a lot, particularly in home care, we have seen a fantastic price increase for wages to pay about 15% more on the award for workers. That's great. But we saw something like 22% increases that went through in the price rise that happened at the same time. So we added extra things onto it. We can charge up to 35%, or provider can charge up to 35% in home care for case management and package management. So basically administration to coordinate their services, whilst at the same time their hourly rate can be 1.5 to 2.5 higher than you'd get elsewhere for having somebody to come clean your home or do your gardening or take you to the shops. So in addition to the unit prices being greater than the market, we're then charging on top of that a standalone stream of income. These things that were traditionally delivered by government. So there are a number of examples where people like myself, who aren't economists, sit there and go, doesn't quite feel right. Not quite sure why, don't have the answers for you, but certainly happy to talk to you about the issues.
Yeah, well, thank you. That's very interesting. So in a sense, I'm really interested in this because we kind of hear the impact of prices on non-retired people. I mean, the typical picture is on non-retired person, retired people. An awful lot of them have a really bad time. And they're not in a position to just handle them. And I suppose often they're not in as good a position to shop around and so on, and get around and all that. They're more at the mercy of immediately here and there, or where they traditionally shop in their little area. So on, they're probably not so good at buying on the internet and things of that sort. Do you, these extra prices, particularly aged care and the services and so on, do you have anything more in the way of, quote, evidence that goes from beyond stories? You've got something that I haven't had time to read this properly. Oh, I see. So you've got a survey about overdue bills.
Yes, about 1 in 5 people over 50. This is a nationally representative sample of about 1,500 people. Were saying that they had overdue bills when the survey was completed. On average, about 3.5 of them. 16% were saying that, so that's slightly higher than it was in 2021, which was 16%. 11% saying electricity and gas, 8 being council rate, 7 for car vehicle insurance, 6% mobile phones and internet connections, home contents insurance. So these are the bills they're choosing not to pay. What we get from the qualitative discussion is that people prioritise their mortgage if they've got one. They prioritise their private health insurance in case something goes wrong with them. They prioritise the base level of energy that they need, depending on their house configuration. It might be their electricity bill or the gas bill. And then after that, everything else becomes a trade-off of what's available. Obviously, mortgage or rent, I should have said. So that's some of the data comes through there.
So this data here is about overdue bills and that sort of thing. But can I put the question the other way around? Do you have anything actually on the prices? The fact they're overdue bills tells me something. What I'd be especially interested in is the other side of it, data on the prices that are hitting older people and whether that comes through in surveys.
Haven't asked them the specifics on the prices.
No.
You see in the qualitative responses that prices have gone up. So commentary. We can go back and see if we can pull some more specifics on that for you.
I am actually really interested in it.
What was exactly you'd like to know?
Well, I'm not so interested in things that we all know about, like energy and banks and that stuff, but more the services that are provided to aged people. Maybe I'm improvising as I put, but home care, has that gone up? And is there a story there? Is it that the home care providers are copping extra costs and may even be better pay for the workers, which is needed, or is there something systematic going up? Like, to give you another story, it's not that relevant to this. With the NDIS, we all know that people who might have provided a service for $50 an hour now get $100, and that's been used quite a lot. Now again, that's slightly special because the government's paying the bill.
The aged care, they're doing the same.
And the aged care, so in the NDIS, situation is ripe for price exploitation. Although I'd say my thing, well, all we can do is tell the government to try to manage the prices a bit better. But there are other bits. I'm making it up as I go along. But
no, you're right.
Say you're aged care and you're not covered in some way. You'd cop higher price rises probably. And I'm interested in bills that hit the actual aged person more than the ones that hit the government.
So there's a couple of ways to look at this. We see examples of a home care package price list that has a premium on the hourly rate compared to the same company delivering the same service under their private service category. That's because they'll say that the cost of compliance is greater. Not sure that the cost of compliance is an extra $10 an hour. But because government's contributing to, I don't have the figure in front of me, I think about 85% of the total cost of care, and the consumers adding out of their own pocket the 15% difference. But that individualized budget is believed by most consumers to be owned by them because it's allocated to them. So they treat it like their money, which is why there's lots of money for a rainy day left over. They want to shop around and get that best price. So they'll talk to us about particularly the case management and administration charges. Governments started to deal with that beginning of the year, capped at 35% to get rid of some of the outliers. The new support at home program, they're talking about government setting an hourly rate. And the provider being able to set the hourly rate. And there is a link I've put in there to up to December 22 publications of the average home care price hourly rates that the government publishes over the last couple of years. The introduction of price caps from 1 January and the introduction of the 15% pay increase on 1 July, we would expect, along with inflation, to see those average prices to go up. The question is, how much will they have gone up above that ballpark 11.5%, because 80% of cost of staff, so 80% times 15% pay wide, on
Yeah.
average increase of price about 11.5%, along with CPI. That should roughly come out to be no more than about ballpark 16-18%.
Yeah.
When you get above that, we're starting to wonder whether they've just shifted money from the administration into the hourly rate.
Yeah.
It hasn't been systematic analysis on this that's been made
No.
public.
And who cops the bill? I'm slightly mixed up between the
Sure.
government copping it and
Who ultimately pays it or who receives the actual bill?
who cops it? Who ultimately pays?
So an individual who's been assessed for a home care package receives a bundle of services, $50,000 level one, $35,000 level three on parking prices.
Yeah.
And then that individual budget gets charged by the provider against their hours that they're being served. Okay.
Yeah.
So in a sense, from the older person's perspective, they're paying it. But of that total amount, they might be paying up to 17.5% of their pension towards that total $50,000.
Yeah.
Or if they've got means testing may increase that amount.
Oh, yeah.
So that's what I was saying before, about 85% of the amount of those packages ultimately have come from government funds. And the 15% has come from pension and means testing.
Yeah.
For somebody who's got more means, that'll be much more of a 60-40 ratio. Somebody who has less means, they might be paying anything towards a government to pick up the bill.
Yeah. And I'm sort of getting the general picture. So with that 15% or that, say the price is increased by the supplier, the last 15, and say it goes up 10%. Who cops that at the margin? Is it the government or the aged person?
The question is, does the amount of the package increase by 10%? Because if not, ultimately they're getting less services because the amount of the package is staying the same.
Yeah.
So both government and the individual, in essence, cop it because the money is being contributed by them.
Yeah.
But from an older person's perspective, this $50,000 package to give me care and support to remain at home is essentially my money.
Yeah.
So they'll feel like it's their money and they're copying it.
Yeah, that's okay. I get that. Yeah. And this applies mainly home care. That's the first big. I mean, that's the big category, or one of the
Because
big
home care is individualised and allocated to the person, and mainly in home care. We still hear reports of residential. It's a bit more complicated. Residential would have a $550,000 price tag on buying that room for mum to live in. Not actually there for delivering the services. There's extra charges for that. But because people are sold the home and they've bought a $500,000 thing called the aged care nursing home for mum or dad, they will be feeling like it should be $500,000 worth of services. Often it's not. Somebody can be in a residential aged care as a fully supported resident, not contributing any of that accommodation cost, just contribute 85% of their pension towards their everyday living expenses. Somebody can be there with means testing, contributing, 50 grand a year.
That's really interesting. Less than interesting, but interesting.
One of the, so I've been looking at transparency in home care prices for about half a decade now. There is nowhere where you can go and actually go, what is fair market rate? What is the actual average? How much is this person charging me compared to another person? I would have thought by now we would see comparison tools between providers. All of these things that are often talked about as market forces, none of it's really eventuated. So where is the downward pressure on prices beyond the small percentage of maybe 10% of new entrants into the market that are offering what's called self-management, where that's case management instead of being 35%, might come down to about 12% because the individual's doing a lot for themselves rather than having it done by the provider.
Wow.
And when we say we're entering into a contract in the market, usually this would be somebody actually having the capacity to negotiate. It's kind of take it or leave it.
So with comparison websites, Firstly, there's usually huge industry resistance. Secondly, they raise, and they sometimes correct things about you can't compare services, some are better than others and all that. But where comparison websites have come in, mainly on the financial services side, they've worked fairly well. And people have not fallen for the obvious things, that someone's offering a low price but poor service. Most people are kind of aware of that kind of thing. It would be interesting. You've mentioned along the way price lists. Are these issued by the providers?
So aged care providers are required to publish on myagecare.gov.au their prices.
Right.
They're also required to put it as part of their home care agreement. So this is the data in which the department's able to use this link to create the summary of home care.
Yeah.
But obviously, due to competition and collusion, not too much details out there.
No.
Price indicated by the department, but it's very hard for an individual to know, if I'm being charged 72, is that industry standard or is actually 65 industry standard?
Yeah, and if you looked up the website, you'd find, why wouldn't you find it very useful to see the prices there? Are they complicated or?
No, I think they're not complicated on My Aged Care. I think they're quite easy to do a comparison between two people.
Yeah.
But whether that's actually going to be reflective of your individual circumstances, you've got specialised wound care, maybe you need a different kind of nurse level, therefore it's this rate. We can't get somebody out to you because there's a journey with this rate. There's those challenges to go through.
Yeah, that's it. When government set prices, the other thing is a plus and a minus.
Everybody goes straight to the line.
Yeah. Right. I used to say, if you want to run a cartel, a private one, everyone cheats on it. But if the government does it for you, sets the price, you don't have to worry about a competitive.
But in the human services, I'm not sure that the market forces have driven the competition down and made it efficient. We've seen a little bit of green shoots early on, but for the last 6 or so years, I haven't seen a huge amount of actually seeing a lot of competition in there.
No.
Now, granted, aged care's had a massive amount of reform going on, Royal Commissions, now legislative reform, new act next year. There are other things at play in the market that can make competition less of a priority. But that still doesn't explain why somebody feels like, 35% of their money is going out for very little service in return. So I don't quite understand why.
Yeah, just that Royal Commission, did that go into that very much, or?
Didn't go into the detail of pricing management about quality and safety of the service types.
Yeah. On another aspect of it all, hard to generalise, but I'll see what you think. Can you make many generalisations about the economic position of aged people now, as opposed to 5, 10, 20 years ago? Is it better, worse? They struggle more, they struggle less, or?
Oh, look, no two older people are the same, so just need to say that at the beginning. But we do see from things like our State of the Old Nation survey that people are struggling a little bit more in terms of the amount of money they've got at the end of the day, the bills they're paying, being comfortable, their pessimism, their outlook. But I couldn't give you a qualifier.
No. Could we see that survey? You mentioned it there.
Yeah.
Interested in that. Actually, I'm going to even ask you if you send it in, if you want to make a couple of comments on what to look for.
Can do.
Be interested in that.
Yeah.
Is the compulsory super making much difference at this stage, or is it a future?
So it's a really interesting question that government's going to tackle later this year, based on a comment by the Treasurer when he released the IGR, the Intergenerational Report. But it's great that people got access to more money. What we see though is that three things sort of impact whether they spend it. One is this issue of, am I going to need money for a rainy day later on? Car breaks down, hip replacement, got to move home, whatever it might be. So not having access to alternative ways to get that money, i.e. credit, not being able to necessarily feel comfortable paying it back, means I need to have access to a lump sum for later on. That's the first one. Second one is that they want that money for medical or aged care later on. So they put a section away. Third one is that government issues what's called a minimum drawdown rate of how much you must take out of your superannuation when you retire. This is widely misunderstood, and it's widely interpreted as a recommended drawdown rate. And the period between those two is probably a good 5% difference between where you would set a recommended drawdown rate versus where you'd have a minimum drawdown rate. Don't quote me on the percentage.
No.
So because of that, people go, oh, government says I must draw down 6% of my balance. I've spent 40 years hearing from my super fund about grow your balance, grow your balance. I've got 50,000, 100,000, 250,000 when I retire. None of that language actually talks about you have enough money to receive an extra $150 a fortnight. Actually what the money was for. So you're treating 40 years of mentality of accumulate the nest egg. You're not actually sending signals along the way of how to educate them about what to do with that nest egg when you get there. And then you've got government recommending, being misinterpreted, but actually draw down less.
God, that's interesting. I think I know where that recommendation came from.
And you need to do something to say in return for the tax breaks that we put into super, you've got to take this out. But yeah, it'll be one of the things I think the Treasurer's paper will look at later this year.
That's interesting. Any impact from the aging of the population? Is that change things much?
Look, there'll be impacts in certain sectors insofar as older people might be more inclined to purchase a particular thing versus younger cohorts, but I don't think the aging of the population drives unfair pricing practices.
No. It's more, I suppose, putting it crudely, very old people, you get this idea they live a long time, they've run out of money by then, but on the whole, they tend to over save, they where they've got the dough.
So the intergenerational report that was just released a couple of weeks ago indicated $1 in $5 that you retire with, you'll have when you pass away and go down to the next generation. Estimated to go up to 1 in 3 because of some of these behavioural things that don't actually encourage you. How much money do you need for a dignified retirement, Professor Fells? Nobody knows specifically. And when you do, it doesn't quite feel right. When you then see a financial advisor who gets a financial return to sell you a product, you're not entirely sure you agree with it. You then see government say, I only need to draw down this amount. I'll listen to that. I trust it. Or lots of different complicated factors here, let alone the fact all the research shows us that 60% of people just don't want to make a decision. They don't want to be involved. It's too complicated for them. It's the biggest financial transaction they'll ever do, second to a house purchase in Sydney. Lots of complexity here about how people are able to retirement.
Well, we may come back, I think.
Yeah, feel free.
Well, this very useful. Thank you. Thank you for giving it to us. Another angle, as you know, we forget the aged, and they have special problems from high prices and gouging.
We look forward to seeing the report.
Okay, thanks very much. Good. So we've got is Philip Clark here yet? Is Philip Clark arrived? So we'll turn it on. And so we have Professor Philip Clark, Law School, University of Melbourne. Correct?
Correct.
Good. And you have done a good submission for us. I have certainly read it through. I haven't sort of gone into detail, but it's got some very important points in there. And actually, it's actually meant to be a tribute to you. I was going to grill you a bit harder than I might others, because you've got something really serious to say in there about changing the unconscionable conduct law, exclusion of upfront pricing.
Yeah, the unfair contract terms.
Yeah, unfair contract. Yeah. So, but maybe for the benefit of the audience, you focus on your concern. It's slightly technical in a sense, which is necessary, but maybe speak in general for a few minutes about it, and then I've got questions about it, because it's a very important recommendation, and we've got to talk a bit about it, what do we do about it? So over to you.
All right, well, I've interpreted your terms of reference broadly
to
cover all forms of unfair pricing.
Yeah.
Consequently, not only price gouging, but also price squeezing.
Yeah.
It seems to me that that's important to really try and provide protection, not only for conventional consumers, but also for small businesses as well.
Yeah.
Second point I'd make is that, again, as you would know, the Australian consumer law doesn't contain a general prohibition of unfair pricing.
No.
It does prohibit a number of specific forms of unfair pricing, such as drip pricing, false representation about pricing, multiple pricing, and so on. But there's no general prohibition of unfair pricing that would cover situations in which there is no other form of reprehensible conduct other than charging the unfair price.
Yeah.
As a consequence, naked, blatant price gouging is simply not prohibited in Australian law. There are some other areas in which there is some limited form of price control. Examples include consumer credit, residential tenancy. Interestingly, there's also a requirement for lawyers to charge no more than a fair price for their work and so on. But outside those particular areas and the specific areas that are covered by the Australian consumer law, there's no general prohibition on price gouging or unfair pricing generally.
Yeah.
It seems to me, however, that there is a remedy readily at hand, and it is through an amendment to the Australian consumer law provisions relating to unfair contract terms.
Yeah.
At the moment, there is an exemption in those provisions that prevents them applying to upfront prices.
Yeah.
So all other forms or other terms, I should say, are subject to this requirement that they be fair, but not the upfront price.
Yeah.
As a consequence, that puts a price gouger in the position of being able to, economic circumstances permit them to do it, stipulate an unfair price, but it's not, as a result of this exemption, caught by the provisions and therefore not subject to attack. It seems to me that if that exemption were removed, it would have the effect of effectively smothering price gouging across all of the economy. It would be, in all of those circumstances covered by the unfair contract terms provisions, consumer contracts, small business contracts, in all of those types of contracts, it would have the effect, as I just said, of smothering price gouging. And it would do that in two different ways. In the first place, it would provide protection to the individual consumer or small business who would be in a position to be able to object to the price. Now, that would be of of benefit, I think, to individual consumers, particularly in relation to large contracts that they may make, or contracts that operate over a significant period of time. But the real benefit of the change would be that, as you would know, from the 9th of November, the ACCC is going to be able to take action against people who include or seek to enforce unfair contract terms. Previously, at this very moment, here we are in whatever it is, September. I was going to say worried about Collingwood tomorrow night, but here we are in September. At this time, the effect of the Act is just to make terms void. But as a result of changes introduced last year, which come into effect on the 9th of November, including an unfair contract term or seeking to enforce an unfair contract term will become a contravention of the Australian consumer law, and the ACCC can take action against the contravener. So consequently, a price gouger who sought to demand an unfair price or sought to enforce an unfair price would contravene the Act and be subject to prosecution by the ACCC. And as you know, the penalties now are quite significant. The $10 million or the triple the value and so on and so forth. They're very significant enforcement powers. And as a result of the ACCC having that power, it would, for the first time, have a power to generally tackle price gouging. At the moment, all it can do is pick out those areas in which there may be a false representation of some sort or other. And that would not cover naked price gouging. Or, as is, you may have done this yourself, but it's certainly come up more recently, trying to name and shame price gouges. Well, that's a very limited, I would think, remedy. But come the 9th of November, it will have this general power to prosecute. And I think that would have a very smothering effect on price gouging, and it would enable the Commission to really get at people who are engaged in this pernicious form of activity.
Now, can I just ask two trivial, small questions, and then we'll get on to something more serious. Present law, I mean, it includes the exemption, but putting that to one side. These provisions make the contract void, is that right? And can the ACCC take action? No, it can't. Oh, I see. So I know.
No.
Yep, got it.
At the moment, it's just a private remedy. Our contract is void. The ACCC has no role.
Okay.
It has a very limited role. It can get a declaration, and it certainly has worked with industry in particular to try and get industry to take its unfair terms out. So it's tried to intrude itself into the activity. And I think it's done very valuable work like that, but it can't take action against somebody for including or enforcing an unfair term. And
when you just said it was, they could do it generally, you meant right across the board, so to speak, nearly, but it'd still be case by case, would it?
Well,
I mean, it might have a case, might have a wide effect.
Yes, sure.
It's a case by case.
It would be case by case. And of course, I should say, in relation to financial services, the same change should be made to enable ASIC to do the same thing in relation to financial services.
That's a really important point. Yes, I hadn't thought of that. We should just note that.
I mean, I focused in my submission on the ACL and the ACCC, but there are similar provisions in the ASIC Act, and the same amendment should apply there to give ASIC the power that I've suggested the ACCC should have. What the ACCC will have, I should say, in relation to all other terms.
Now, I'm still just going around mud. I've got a more serious question in a few minutes. With the present provision that exempts upfront prices, are there any prices left to cover?
Anything that's not an upfront price is covered.
So what would be an example?
Well, it might be a price variation. So you might say that the price is $100 for whatever, but in 6 months' time, I can increase the price. But you can't decrease it, then that price variation would be covered. Yes.
So if you got more bite in,
Now, the reason why that's worth noting, and I've included a brief note about this in my submission, it's an appendix A, I think, is that distinguishing from an upfront price from a price that's not characterized can be a difficult issue. And in the United Kingdom, they have struggled sometimes to work out which one it is. And of course, that just adds to legal complexity and legal costs and making the law more difficult to administer. And of course, if you did what I've suggested, it would obliterate that difficulty because the distinction would no longer be relevant.
And hanging in on the old, ignoring your proposal from it, if that got more bite, the current law business would find ways of making their upfront prices not upfront.
Prices that are not upfront are caught now.
Oh, sorry, the other way around, I should have said.
So if the price exemption is removed, all prices
I agree.
be subject to being fair. And so any form of price, whether it's upfront or in the bowels of the agreement, would be subject to challenge.
What I meant was just before we get to the real stuff, say the non-upfront price got seriously tackled, I suppose businesses would find ways of turning it into an upfront price.
Well, yes, that's possible. But price gouging, as I understand it, focuses primarily on the upfront price. It's demanding that ridiculously high price for the toilet roll or the pharmaceutical or whatever it might be.
Now, I've got another trivial question. You do it in unfair contract law, but it wouldn't be in the unconscionable law. That's obvious. Could you tell me, first year undergraduate, why you do it unfair contract, not unconscionable?
At the moment, it is possible to argue that a price for a product is unconscionable, but it's very difficult to establish that. There's great uncertainty as to what the ingredients of unconscionable conduct are under the Act. Under the equitable rules, you need to be in a position of dominance, take advantage of that, exploit the position and so on. Whether those requirements are also required for statutory unconscionability under the Act remains somewhat unclear. There has been great resistance to a suggestion that I've made many years ago of specifically including price as one of the factors that the courts can take into account. Now, I've suggested many times that price be added to that, but it's simply been ignored by whoever looks at these things. So that's the first point I make. The second point I'd make is that the unfair contract terms provisions, I think, would be a more powerful. The concept of unconscionability conceptually is thought of as being or requiring more obnoxious conduct, if I can call it that, than merely unfair. That to be unconscionable, you have to be more than just unfair. You have to be exploitive in situations of inequality. So the difference may be fine in some cases, and undoubtedly some forms of unfair conduct would be unconscionable, I believe. But as I say, conceptually, unconscionability is generally thought of as being a more venal and objectionable form of conduct than unfair, with the result that if you focus on unfair, you're going to catch more situations.
Good point. Okay, let's turn to the more serious bit, what you recommend. Who would it, what transactions would it cover? You mentioned, so
it would cover all transactions that are consumer contracts, like whenever a consumer buys something for personal use. Toilet rolls, the pharmaceuticals, the flight centre, houses, everything. Everything that a consumer buys or acquires for personal use or consumption. It would also cover small business contracts, which again, what's a small business contract is being expanded somewhat. It's businesses that employ less than 100 and there's or alternatively a monetary limit of 10 million or so.
Something like
it's going to catch, small business contract, all the contracts that they make. And that's both supply contracts and acquisition contracts.
Yeah.
One of the things you'll see from my submission that's always concerned me
Oh,
was
yeah.
the potential exploitation of dairy farmers.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was always upset by the fact
Yeah.
that they were suffering a price squeeze in relation to the farm gate price of milk.
Yeah.
And well, you'll see, I've made reference to that, which is why I framed my submission in terms that covers price squeezes as well as gouging.
Yeah. Okay.
So
That-
the only sort of I regard as unfortunate limitation is that the contract would have to be what's regarded as a standard form contract. But it's important to bear in mind that what a standard form contract
yeah.
is not something that's common across a group. It essentially means a non-negotiated contract.
I see. So,
So
yeah.
if you and I at this minute were to enter into a contract
Yeah.
about something, you've never made one of these contracts before,
Yeah.
but you were to make it on terms that you dictated.
Yeah.
You said there's no negotiation here, Philip. You
Yeah.
take it or leave it.
Yeah.
That would be a standard form contract, even though you've never made one before.
Yeah.
Now I'm emphasizing that because the phrase standard form contract
Yeah.
is misleading.
Yeah.
It gives,
I didn't
it
realise
gives the
that.
impression that you must have made lots of these before.
Yeah.
Every time you make a contract, you do it. It doesn't, it can mean that,
Yeah.
it can cover that, but it can also cover a situation in which you say to me, here are the terms, take it or leave it, no negotiation. You know, these were what I previously decided to impose upon you, end of story.
Yeah. And that point about a standard contract can cover a new one-off.
Yes.
That's well established law, is it, in regard to unfair contracts?
Well, I think it's fairly clear from the wording of the Act, yes. And indeed, the changes that were made to the Act nearly 12 months ago, and which come into operation on the 9th of November this year, really go, I think, to that issue. They respond to the ways in which people were trying to get around that requirement, or avoid that requirement, I should say, by having pretend negotiation about issues that they didn't.
I see. Yeah.
You pretending that you wanted to negotiate about this, and
Yeah.
hence to say, well, look, we did negotiate about that pen,
Yeah.
and therefore it's not a standard form contract. Now they're directed really at that point, and I think it reinforces the interpretation that I've put on that. Again, I've argued that that requirement should be removed as well, but that's so far fallen on deaf ears.
So now we get to the heart of things. What is an unfair price and how would that be determined? You've made a comment in there, courts do deal with prices, but just anyway, if you could address that issue.
Well, I've defined unfair price in line with the Act. It would be a price which causes a degree of imbalance between the parties. You're charging exorbitant, I'm having to pay it's one that is unreasonable, having regard, for example, to the inherent economic value of the product involved. And the cost of this, thinking from the perspective of price gouging, the cost of the supplier in providing the item, their acquisition costs, their transaction costs and so on. And one that causes detriment to the person having to pay, the poor consumer that's having to pay something that they really can't afford to pay in order to get something which is relatively essential to them in the particular circumstances in which they apply. Now, framed in that way, it fits in with the definition of unfair in the Act, but it also borrows somewhat from the terminology used in the United Brands case, in European the Commission definition of what an unfair price would be for purposes of their abuse of dominant position law.
Just say a little more on that. The other people need to explain, or put in other words, I forgot. I can't remember the details of United Brand.
Well,
is that the bananas?
Yes.
Yeah, the bananas.
Yes, very good. Very briefly, European competition law prohibits an abuse of dominant position. And one of the forms of abuse that has been identified is charging an excessive price.
Could I just interrupt you just to note that the Australian competition law, the competition provision, have no such thing in the abusive market. You know that, but
Yeah.
I'm just saying it. There's no such thing in the competition law, and it's worth asking whether we should add that onto the section 46 abusive market power. Anyway, that's by the by.
So,
I'm interrupting. Go back to bananas.
so it's been, I think, well established in European competition law that this prohibition on abusing your position of dominance, abusing your dominant position, can embrace charging an excessive price, and an excessive price was explained in that case to be one in which the price charged bore no reasonable economic relation to the inherent economic value of the product involved. Now that reference to no reasonable relationship to the inherent economic value of the product is one that's been picked up in the competition laws of places like Israel, South Africa and Germany and so on. And they have tended to define an excessive price as one in which the price charged bears no, again, economic relationship to the inherent value of the product.
That's, and we're digressing slightly, but this is pretty relevant to this question of, what is gouging? There's some case law on it. Anyway, carry on. Sorry, interrupt you.
So, well, I think I've said all I can. It's one in which you're comparing essentially the price being charged to the inherent economic value of the product. In circumstances in which there's no reasonable explanation for the charge. If I were to charge $100 for a toilet roll, for example, it may be possible for me to explain that there's a reason for that. Because, supplies limited, trucks have had to go over more bridges than normal. I could come up with a possible justification. But unless I could explain why the price has gone from $10 to $100 overnight, by reference to things like that, increased transport costs, whatever else. Unless I could provide that explanation, the price would be, in that case, demonstrably unreasonable. And as a result, I would be contravening the unfair terms provisions of the Australian consumer law if the exemption was removed, and I'd be liable to prosecution by the ACCC.
And individual action too.
Well, individual action, there'd be a contravention, and the individual consumer could take action for the contravention. And
okay.
So
when they bought the banana or something.
Whether they could get damages is less clear. There are provisions in the Act at the moment that, as far as unfair contract terms are concerned, preclude the recovery of damages. So the individual consumer would be able to say that the term was void, and then they would have other remedies in law as a result of that term being void, which may enable them to get the money back. But the real power of the suggestion I'm making is not what it does privately for the individual consumer. It's by empowering the ACCC to really be able to take action against price gouges, which, as I said repeatedly now, it cannot do at the moment.
Now, so anyway, that heads off something I was going to raise. I still feel I'm skirting around the core issues, but I suppose you're talking about the ACCC. In some areas of the law, including some areas of consumer law, you have small claims tribunals and things to deal with smaller matters quickly and expeditiously and less legalistically. I'm sure you can think of more examples than me, instances where it would be better to have an informal, low-level type thing. Is that, why wouldn't that be a better process?
Because it requires upon the individual taking action,
Okay,
and
yeah, okay.
which is fine. I mean, I've got no objection to the individual taking action, but in small consumer situations,
Yeah.
the individual is not going to go to court over $100 worth of toilet roll.
No.
There may be some important health pharmaceutical type of products. I gave examples there, the EpiPens and so on. Exorbitant charges for those sorts of things that might warrant the consumer who's going to be buying these things over a long period of time
Yeah,
going to court. But if I've had a one-off situation with toilet rolls, I'm not going to go to court. But if I'm a price gouger, I believe I should be exposed to being prosecuted by the ACCC.
Yeah.
I think you'd appreciate that with the Australian consumer law, although it gives individual or creates rights that consumers individually can enforce,
yeah,
and that's valuable. In practice, they tend not to operate other than in respect of major consumer items like cars and so on. So if you look in the VCAT reports, most of the cases are about cars. It's only when you're buying a car that you're really buying something
yeah,
that is of sufficient value or cost to
yeah,
you that it's worth going to court. If you buy, as I did the other day, a $400 watch that doesn't work, I'm not going to go to court over that.
no,
As an informed consumer, I may be able to badger the supplier because I would
Yeah.
quote the ACL to them up,
yeah,
badger them individually. But unless
Yeah.
I know about my rights under the ACL, I'm not going to go to a lawyer over a $400 watch.
so, I mean, I think it's a really good, interesting submission across thought, but I also, frankly, I blanch at the thought that almost any price in the economy is covered by this. I mean, the whole history has been minimal price regulation. We bring it in for monopolies and stuff. Yeah, and this like covers it.
Well,
I could, say, I think Woolies is overcharging on something, taking advantage of strong demand. There's some new product and everyone loves it and a little bit limited in supplies that they charge. They could be caught by this.
it could be. But there are a couple of qualifying factors to bear in mind.
Yeah,
Realistic, real life situations. You were talking about Woolies. If you were unhappy, you're probably not going to do anything about it. You may be
No.
unhappy about the price. The effectiveness of this reform comes into play when you go to the ACCC, you're irritated about this, you go to the ACCC and say, look, Woolies have been charging so and so.
yeah,
The ACCC will then look into it. And they will, make an assessment, presumably. I mean, you'd know more about how the ACCC works than me. They would make an assessment of whether they thought Woolies really was
yeah,
and whether it was really serious enough.
yeah,
And only if after that investigation, they thought that Woolies, using Woolworths should apologize with a hypothetical example, only if they thought that they were, after that sort of preliminary investigation, would litigation commence. You and I individually are most unlikely to do that.
yes, okay.
The second point I'd make
But there
is,
might be a class action.
well, there could be, but
Yeah.
again, that's only going to get going when experts have looked at it and worked out that there's sufficient merit in the matter to warrant the investment that's required to mount a class action, either by the Commission or privately. The position at the moment is that all other terms of the contract are exposed like this. I mean, it's not as though, this is something that in one sense is radical. All terms in consumer contracts, small business contracts are potentially exposed to being unfair, including those price terms embedded in the contract and that aren't part of the upfront. But it's the upfront price or it's in respect of the upfront price that the gouging occurs or the
Yeah.
squeezing occurs. And at the moment, that's immune from attack.
Yeah. I'm still worried, I know we've discussed already, like unfair. Now, you've quoted bananas, it's price exceeding economic value. It could be a price exceeding cost plus a reasonable profit. It could be price exceeding what would obviously occur in a competitive market, etc. It's still quite a hard thing to define.
Look, the courts have a responsibility to do this at the moment across a range of things. For example, consumer credit. I mean, there are things like unfair, sometimes called unjust, sometimes called unconscionable in relation to the credit rates.
Okay.
I mentioned to you, almost as an amusing aside, the fact that legal costs are to be fair and reasonable. Now, if ever that was going to be challenged, you'd have to show that you know the lawyer would have to show they were fair, or the plaintiff that they were unfair. It's already there. The same is true in residential tenancy. There are provisions relating to the rent that can be charged and so on that are very similar to determining that whether they're fair or not. So the concept of evaluating whether, using terms loosely now, the charge is fair or unfair exists already in a range of different areas. The problem at the moment is that it is limited to those specific areas and doesn't catch many instances of price gouging.
So with that, I just I see the logic of what you're saying and quite strong legal arguments. But that one's not going to get through. I just know that would never get through Parliament. Because the picture would be, well, what's unfair and covers all prices. And we spent the last 50 years trying to get rid of price regulation. And this thing,
You see, it's not regulating the price. It's not. It's just saying if you charge an unfair one, then you're liable.
Okay, it's not regulation.
It's not regulation at all.
No.
And I would argue that the proposition of saying you must not do something that's unfair is the very raison d'etre of the unfair terms provision. It applies to every other term, including internal price terms. It just exempts the upfront price. One of the reasons why I have framed my paper in the way that I did was to also encompass price squeezing, because picking up the point you just made about Parliament, a reform that is directed to also assisting small business,
we get some support.
will pick up a lobby, and you can appreciate the appeal that what I've suggested here would have or would have had, for example, to all those farmers back in the dairy inquiry who were feeling squeezed about their farm gate price.
Now,
so there's an alliance there to be developed.
So I don't mean this badly, because you've argued it extremely persuasively, but are there any halfway houses on it? Because that's the other thing that really be. I just know that every price in the country would be covered by this law.
Yes.
Every price, big and small.
Yes. And
what are the safeguards? The only one is those people at the ACCC.
Well,
they've had weird chairs in that job. I know myself. At least one weird one. So why trust them? And also, of course, there'll be I don't know what the word is, but opportunistic behaviour by people. So I bet you that if I personally wrote a letter to Coles and said, I'm going to take you on your price, that thing is not going to win, but this guy used to be chair. It's better to pay him something and shut him up, wouldn't it? There'd be quite a lot of that behaviour.
Well, look, just focusing on that, Alan, if you were to do it, yes.
Yeah.
If I was to do it, they would say something else, I suspect.
Yeah.
But to come back to your serious question, I do have grave reservations about halfway houses.
Yeah.
I would admit to being normally predicated in favour of them. I like the idea of, you know, trying to reach a compromise with you about things, and let's split the difference. I'm somewhat hesitant to do it in relation to this, because to me, the virtue of what I'm saying is so overwhelmingly true that I wouldn't want to see it watered down. But I can suggest one to you. I do it with great hesitation.
Okay.
And it is to include in the provision a presumption that the price is fair.
That is, I can see why I don't like even saying it.
Yes, exactly. I washed my mouth out. Please don't record what I just said. But if there was, I mention that because there are a series of presumptions in the Act. For example, in relation to the unfair contract terms provisions, there is a presumption that the contract is a standard form contract.
Yeah.
If the plaintiff asserts, as they need to, that the contract is a standard form contract, there is a presumption in their favour that it is.
Oh, right.
So that therefore the supplier, if they want to say, no, this contract's not caught, they bear the burden of proving that it is not a standard form contract. Now, using that formula, you could easily imagine a situation in which the upfront price it can be challenged, but in each case there is a presumption that the price there's a presumption that the upfront price is fair. Therefore, you know, imposing upon the plaintiff the burden of proving that it is unfair. Now they have that anyway, but if there was a presumption that it was fair, it would be a hurdle that would be a little bit more difficult to overcome for.
Okay. And there are presumptions, as you know, in part 4.
Yes.
There's a debate about extending the presumption the other way.
I think the fear that this would lead to frivolous claims of unfair pricing are, you know, can be exaggerated. I think individuals sometimes may feel aggrieved, but to actually do something about it, you know, requires people to spend time and money. And, you know, I'm less worried than you appear to be that we're going to be suddenly swamped by people making frivolous claims like this. And the safeguard, as you have acknowledged, for businesses is that the real person of whom they should be fearful is the ACCC, and the ACCC is going to have to investigate the matter and form a considered opinion before it takes action. Otherwise, it's going to lose the case and incur the costs of that.
So you might be interested to know that the Howard Costello government, as you know, had the GST law, and in some ways it was a regulator's dream because covered every price. We counted up. This was 20 years ago. On the day GST was introduced, 1 billion prices changed on that day. If you counted up the number of tea towels or something, the price of tea towels across the economy. They might have doubled it for today. Now, and then it was fairly draconian law, and it was simpler than what we were discussing because it said sort of price is unfair if it's more than warranted by GST price increase.
Yes, sure.
And there was a bit of a let out. There wasn't that much of a let out. Well, it said if other things justified it. Okay. Now, I can assure you the ACCC is extremely hawkish on this. And we did take action, but every time we had an unfair price, we thought we're not going to get this one through court over the intangibility of unfair. So we went on deceptive and misleading, and you could normally find something deceptive and misleading. So at its most hawkish moments, because I've never been more hawkish, and we had a commission of very hawkish people, as you know, in my time. We always took refuge in misleading and deceptive, and it was relatively easy to win. But maybe it's litigable.
Well, that's why I've emphasised, I think, in what I've been trying to say this afternoon in my submission, that it's focused on blatant, naked, what I call naked price. That is, in which the person stipulates a price, there's no misleading or deceptive conduct or false representation.
No.
Because clearly, if there is, you're often running on
okay.
section 29 or section 18 and so on. So we're talking about the person who just simply demands a high price because they're able to, or an unfair high price because they're able to.
I think that's it. Thank you. It's a really good submission, very thought-provoking. Thinking that I just tell you frankly, I'm worried about it. Partly politically, partly, I don't know, it's a hell of a big thing. But a really good submission.
Well, maybe, you've got a Labor government.
Yeah, maybe
if it's now or never.
Yeah. Okay, terrific. Thank you very much.
All right, my pleasure.
Give your regards to she who must be obeyed.